We're ready? All right, thanks everybody for being here this morning. Everybody here in the room and then those of you that are online joining us remotely. And do you know how many people we have online right now?
Right now we have 27 in counting.
Hey, all right. I think we had 60 registrations. I think some people choose to view the recording after they get the kids to school and wake up and have their coffee. So I think if you're in the room, turn off audio because it interferes with the owls. If you have anything going on or a device, please do that. And then I'll have people turn off your audio if you're online. Make sure you have it off until Q&A. And then if you're online, please, my job is to filter questions from the end. So we'll do that. I'm Stratis, Giannakouros. I direct the Office of Sustainability and the Environment at the University of Iowa, but today I represent myself in this conversation. The organizers of this are two really close friends, and then also Craig Mosier, who I've worked with even longer. So Cheryl Miller is part of JCED. This is the Johnson County Energy District. Ann Guin, who is a former student of mine and really just an amazing person, is the co-host and technical support and also part of JCED. And then Craig Mosier and Betsy Fisher, obviously part of JCED. And they are also running the welcome and breakfast table. So if you're not here, you can have a virtual bagel. So I want to introduce JCED, Johnson County Energy District. It's a nonprofit organization dedicated to the transition to clean, renewable energy in Johnson County. And they seek to partner with government, business, building trades, and other groups on energy efficiency and renewable energy projects. I started out at Luther College several years ago, and that's my first encounter with the Clean Energy District model. Andy Johnson, who's on today, had started that up there. And I remember going to energy breakfast in Decorah when it was like 5 below zero and being there with Craig and Paul Johnson and Andy Johnson in the room at T-Box in the basement. Yeah, we have energy breakfast there. So I've been doing this for 9 years. I took a hiatus when I was in Phoenix, but it's not cold today. I want to thank the funders of the Solar Breakfast Initiative. So the Community Foundation of Johnson County and Cook Appraisal LLC. Without their support, things like this are harder to do. And then I just want to give you some background. I gave you, my background, but here locally, this is the start of Energy Breakfast. This is the third of four. We have one more coming up. The goal of this series for this, winter, spring timeframe, I guess we're ending in February, so fall, winter, is a focus on policy. So governmental and non-governmental policy and how we can increase distributed generation to reduce electricity costs. So, greenhouse gas, climate issues, energy independence, those sort of things. Lower peak demand on the grid, increase resilience in case of grid outages, and provide other community benefits. So the goal here is really the policy side. What do we need to do? What's in the pipeline at the State House and what probably needs to be in the pipeline? That's the goal here. So all these meetings are recorded. So if you have to step away for some reason, or you want to come back and watch this several times, because we're so interesting, you're welcome to do so. It'll be on the JCED website. And I don't have an actual URL, but I think if you Google Johnson County Clean Energy District, you'll find us.
Johnson Clean Energy.
Johnson Clean Energy District.
And also there will be an email to all registrants after this with all of the information that's covered in this today.
So a few things are going on, right? The State House, the session's kicking off, the Iowa legislative session's kicking off today. All right, is that correct? No, it's soon, Monday. I think it's Monday. It's next Monday. And school vouchers and taxes get the most attention, but there's a lot of energy related legislation potentially in the pipeline, and that in various forms is there every year. I think with the with new legislation at the federal government level, there's a lot of discussion about how that's going to impact the state of Iowa, how these funds are going to be put out. So I think that this morning we decided to bring in 3 experts. And I say 3 because I'm not experts. I'm moderating on solar policy issues. So we have, I'll introduce our speakers in a minute. The first half of the meeting, we're going to talk about 5 to 6 issues that are important to expanding solar energy in Iowa. These have been curated by Cheryl Miller and Craig after having discussions with a lot of trade groups and folks around. I know that Cheryl's put a lot of work into calling a lot of people to ask what should be on the agenda today. And then the second half, after everyone pontificates, Warren, we will open it up to the room, and we'll have participants ask questions both in the room and online. So really quickly, I'm going to run through bios. Andy Johnson, who's on Zoom today from Decorah, Iowa, is the executive director of Winneshiek Energy District and the Clean Energy Districts of Iowa. So the expanded all Iowa version of the original energy district. It's an umbrella group of newly formed county energy districts across the state, supported by Andy. And for the past 10 years, he has championed energy conservation in Decorah and been a leader in promoting renewable energy and energy efficiency programs at the Iowa Utility Board and at the Capitol. He's worked on issues of siting large-scale solar, interconnection and permitting issues, third-party technical assistance for renewable energy projects, and in the district does a lot more with energy efficiency in general. Also joining us is Lewis Butler. Lewis, you're in, where are you joining us today from?
I'm based out of Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Grand Rapids, Michigan. Excellent. And so he's the national sales manager at GRNE Solar and serves as the president of the Iowa Solar Energy Trade Association, ISETA. He is also a board member of the Illinois Solar Energy Association, Missouri Solar Energy Association, and an advisory board member of the American Solar Grazing Association. He holds a BS in economics from Hillsdale College and an MA of economics from George Mason University. He will focus on offsite solar and virtual net metering and state policies to allow shared or community solar. Sitting to my left here is Warren McKenna. He is a solar consultant working across the Midwest. Formerly, he was a manager at the Farmers Eelectric Co-op in Kelowna, Iowa, where they also make really good yogurt.
Right.
Yep. And where he established Iowa's first community solar project. Farmers Eelectric is now the largest solar utility in the state, and Warren plans to cover issues related to the growing demand for integrated solar generation and storage to ensure reliability of grid electric. So time management wise, it's my job to time keep here. We're going to give Andy Johnson about 15 minutes because he's got a breadth of topics to cover. Lewis, we're going to try to keep you around 10, and Warren 5 to 7 minutes. I don't have a stick or anything to stop you, but I'll just kind of raise my hand if we need to move on. So we have time for questions from folks that are in attendance. The things that we're going to cover, generally each speaker is going to talk about is they're going to define the problem or opportunity. Is it in the state pipeline right now? Is it being looked at, or should it be something we're looking at? What's that opportunity or problem? What do we need to fix it? And then examples from other states or hypothetical, right? I mean, there's a lot of comparison in Nebraska these days in terms of what they've been able to do as a similar state to Iowa that we could emulate. So with that, I'm going to open it up and start here with Andy Johnson. Andy, if you have, the floor is yours if you want to go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Stratis, and everyone else at Johnson Clean Energy District. It's great to be here and really exciting to see everybody on, including co-presenters. Warren is a bit of a mentor of mine, so thanks for doing all the work you've done, Warren, and the work you do too, Lewis. So yeah, I'm going to touch on a few issues, and I might actually name a couple others that we're thinking a lot about, and then leave more of that for discussion. I'll certainly try and stay as brief as I can. Some of you know I can talk forever, so I'll try very hard not to do that. The first and biggest issue, actually, that we are certainly worried about, concerned about, and I'm already working on for this legislative session, is not so much one that we would love to see. So there are certainly policies we would love to see to help promote the solar industry in Iowa. But one that we need to play a little defense on, and that's solar siting. Siting restrictions on all renewables actually are a growing challenge, but solar is the growing renewables with tremendous possibility. Wind, of course, we've seen large-scale wind in Iowa for 15 years now. Resistance has always been there. That resistance is growing too. So there is an anti-renewables movement that has been gaining steam nationwide. Unfortunately, there is a lot of fossil fuel money and interest behind it. The tactics and strategies used are coordinated oftentimes by national and regional groups. And then, of course, as we all know, social media is just an amazing tool for all kinds of things, and including, unfortunately, this movement. And so there are connections and linkages here. None of us should bury our heads in the sand and think this is all just locally grown concern and opposition to renewables, because it's not. That said, there are valid reasons to be concerned. And so what I'm going to try and do is talk really briefly through a few of the key talking points that we're working on for solar siting. The starting point here is the fact that many counties have already been looking at restrictive ordinances that would limit solar and potentially wind, but especially solar on prime farmland. The two main tools of restriction have been setbacks from residences, especially of non-participating landowners, but sometimes other infrastructure as well. And of course, as you get high setbacks that can go 1,000 feet or 1,500 feet, right, then all of a sudden you're excluding huge portions of much of the fields and farmland neighboring areas. The even more onerous requirement that is entirely a poison pill and nothing but is a factor called CSR, corn suitability rating, which is used extensively in the ag and real estate industry to look at the productivity of farmland, which is related obviously to corn growth and production. But CSR then is a number, and the average CSR in Iowa for farmland is around 68. And the CSR restriction that so there was a restrictive solar siting bill that was introduced in last session's legislature that actually passed through the Ag Committee, if I remember correctly. So it's technically still a live bill, and we could see that same one surface or different variants thereof surface this session. So they used a CSR rating and said, thou shalt not put solar on any acres with CSR higher than 65. Well, so obviously that would cover by itself a majority of Iowa farmland. But that doesn't mean that something less than the majority would still be eligible, because CSR varies across the landscape, varies field to field, varies within fields, depending on how you're defining your fields. To do large scale solar, of course, we need large chunks of land in one place, accessible to transmission or distribution, substations, transmission hookups. And so if you're going to limit CSR, if you're going to put these setbacks on, what it amounts to is essentially almost an entire outright ban of utility scale solar across Iowa. And there are lots of ways to run those numbers, but that's kind of what we're facing. Now, in the legislative process, might there be, compromises made, more reasonable voices prevailing? Well, we hope so. But the issue is so critically important because, even quote compromises could still put out of commission the vast majority of Iowa farmland and make it extremely difficult to move ahead developing significant scale solar in this state. Now, we at the energy districts are all for non-wires alternatives. We're all for solar behind the meter. We're all for customer and local owned solar. And that's essentially where we really focus our local work. And we have megawatts worth of customer owned solar in some of our small rural counties. Just here in Winneshiek, we probably have 8 megawatts of locally owned solar that's non-utility. That's a heck of a lot, probably the highest per capita in just about any county in the Midwest. So we really work there. But at the same time, we also believe that large scale utility scale solar is critically important. Iowa needs to develop our solar industry similar to what we've developed wind. For the whole variety of purposes that we're all aware of, ranging from climate stewardship to prosperity, that really is important in all of our counties. So this issue, a few talking points then when it comes to legislative conversations around solar siting. I'm going to run down just a list here. And of course, then we can dive more deeply into these if we need to in discussion or Q&A. We actually like to say the solar suitability rating on every Iowa acre is high. And that's a direct, of course, comparison to corn suitability rating. You can put solar all over the state. It has very high production value pretty much everywhere. You can put it on all kinds of lands and landscapes. Of course, there's certain situations where it's maybe not quite as applicable, but the solar suitability rating, the SSR, is really high. And landowners should have the freedom to farm solar. if they want to, just as they have the freedom to farm other things. So landowner rights is really, really important. And of course, there are other issues around landowner rights and farming rights that groups might differ on. But really, when it comes to producing energy, then let's make the comparison for other forms of energy produced on Iowa farmland. For example, ethanol. This is not a rag on ethanol. Don't get me wrong. I'm going to state that right up front. But about 60%, 55 to 60% of Iowa's corn ground is produced for ethanol. So that is about 7.5 to 8 million acres. 7.5 to 8 million acres of Iowa prime farmland right now is used for energy production, and not nothing but. I mean, yes, there are byproducts, but that is the prime product in use. That's a lot of acres. That's fine. What would solar look like if we needed to put as much solar in Iowa as we had wind production? Let's say, just to match that, we have about 12 gigawatts of wind, 12 gigawatts of solar at more or less 6 acres per megawatt. That can go up and down. We would effectively need no more than 1% of the acres we currently farm for ethanol. We currently farm for energy for that solar ground. At the same time, solar ground can be highly multifunctional, just like wind, of course. The wind fields they take a relatively small acreage for the tower, and the rest of it is still farmed. You can actually farm and get a lot of other landscape benefits out of solar as well. And we can talk a lot about that. Many of you have talked about, pollinator habitat, but just putting any kinds of perennial plants under the solar fields all of a sudden gets you significant wildlife benefits, 5 to 10 times the infiltration of high rainfall events, and soil carbon building, just for example, when we come to the conservation benefits. So there's tremendous multifunctional benefits of solar and landscape as well. The economic benefits are huge. We could go over numbers of what it would look like to put all that solar around Iowa, but the returns to not just landowners, but local governments are really, really, really amazing. And then the last point I want to make on solar siting and one issue that is brought up that has validity is sometimes that, well, okay, local farm groups might say, well, look, if we have 1,000 acres or a few thousand acres of solar in our county, that takes land out of annual commodity production that some of our young farmers need. I get it. I live in a rural county. I farm. I still manage our family's farm. However, we're talking still about such small acres in the big picture of Iowa farm. There have been so many other trends in Iowa ag that have taken land out of production, that have impacted the economics and the availability of land. Land values are already high, regardless of whether there's renewable energy in a county or not. That is the single biggest obstacle to young farmers. Land rental rates are high. And then just let's look at CRP. Almost everyone in Iowa thinks that conservation would agree that Conservation Reserve Program has some real great benefits to Iowa. Well, it takes land out of annual commodity production when you enroll in the Conservation Reserve Program. Iowa farmers have enrolled 1.7 million acres in the Conservation Reserve Program. That's been pretty stable for a number of years. That's way over 10 times, way over 10 times the amount of land we will likely ever have in solar in this state. So there again, the arguments are mostly don't hold water, but this is a really, really big issue that we all need to be well aware of and have conversations with our legislators on. So solar siting, that's a really big one. We need to play defense. The other couple that Stratis and Cheryl asked me to hit on at least a little bit include interconnection challenges. So solar interconnection is very much of a challenge. Many contractors are seeing it. It varies somewhat in the IOU territories, Alliant versus Mid-American. The interconnection rules are developed by the utility board, following, of course, directives from Iowa code, Iowa law. But the board sets the rules. The last time the interconnection rules were reviewed and formalized was a number of years ago. It was in this last decade, but it was at least probably 5 years ago. Steve may have a better memory of that than I do. And at that time, actually, many interveners thought they were not so bad. What happens now, though, is Alliant, especially because I'm more aware of what's happening in Alliant territory, is using every I and T and error and made up error to draw out and delay and roadblock the interconnection process. And it's a really difficult problem for contractors because they need to try and work with the utility to continue having customers. It's a really difficult problem for advocates too, because without specific details and complaints being filed from customers and contractors, it's kind of tough to go to the board and say, hey, this process isn't working. We actually brought it up directly with board members at a meeting up here in Decorah about a year ago. And they were somewhat surprised, and they said, oh, well, we haven't seen all that much of that. And, and we've said, well, here's kind of how it's working. Here's what we're hearing. But yes, because the utilities have, you know, the contractors and the customers kind of, you know, over a barrel, you don't hear a whole lot of it. So it is a very real serious issue, though. And it's not a legislative issue. There could be legislative action, but probably not so good in this political environment. But there could be, you know, some work done potentially through a coalition of contractors and advocates at the board, if we were able to develop, again, a very specific list of examples and exactly what's happening at certain cuts. But that's, again, that's not easy to do, but it's a very real issue. So I'm just kind of confirming that reality, and it's slowing things down dramatically in a lot of cases throughout Alliant territory. The third issue then I was going to mention, briefly discuss, which actually crosses a lot of other policy issues out there, is the need for funding for technical assistance. So a lot of what energy districts try and do is quality institutions. We try and do that analysis, diagnostics, planning that help folks understand what the opportunities are, and then actually move towards getting jobs done in energy efficiency, in renewables, customer-owned renewables, especially solar, of course, and that can include storage nowadays. We've worked a little bit on that. And in the broader issue of electrification for homes, buildings, as well as for transportation. We're working quite a bit in electrification of transportation and in charge stations, networks, and things like that with a lot of our partners. Well, providing good TA takes people and money. And it's not something that the market understands fully the value of. You know, good technical assistance can save customers a whole lot of money when they do understand what needs to be done and then work over the next few years to get a lot of that work done. But it can also cost quite a bit up front. Our energy efficiency ratepayer funded program should be covering more of that. This is a struggle we've long had and will continue to work with this year in the energy efficiency dockets at the board. But this is also something the legislature then could tackle. Many states, for example, have taken some of the ratepayer funded, again, these aren't utility owned energy efficiency programs, they're ratepayer funded, legislatively mandated, have taken some of those dollars and run them through third-party administrators rather than just left them all with utilities. This is a priority of ours. In Iowa, the bulk of the funds could still be left with the investor-owned utilities for managing rebate programs, et cetera, and a chunk, a quarter, say, could be put into a third-party fund for TA. The reason this is so critical right now is not just the long-term opportunity that we've always had for energy efficiency, but the combination with some of these new federal incentives, especially, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act, that has new rebate programs available for a wide variety of homeowners and businesses, but especially the homeowners and the households. And most folks are not going to have a clue how to take advantage of those funds without quality TA. And we don't have it available. The utilities like to say, oh, we have self-assessments on the website, et cetera, but none of that is very valid or helpful or useful compared to in-person technical assistance. So we have a really tremendous opportunity right now to design, to show the need, to demonstrate the need, and try and build maybe that state technical assistance fund with dollars flowing from multiple sources. I think I'm at about 15 minutes, so I'm gonna leave it there. There are a couple other issues that we certainly are working on and maybe can talk more about in Q&A and discussion at the policy legislative level right now that include, for example, maybe delaying implementation of that tax on EV charging and looking hard at integrated resource planning and all source competitive contracts for the investor-owned utilities when it comes to large scale. So pass it back to you, Stratis.
Jandy, right on time. So we're gonna open it up to Lewis and Butler. I want to mention, Lewis, before you start, special thanks to Jeannie Maybanks from ISETA for corralling you to do this. I know you'd have been a willing person to do it anyway, but she behind the scenes did a lot to make calls, to help out, to arrange and get speakers and help us to figure out who would be available. So thanks to Jeannie Niceta. Louis, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for this kind words, and Jeannie definitely is doing good work. It's great to be presenting with Andy and Warren here. These guys have probably been around and been fighting this battle way longer than I've even been in the industry. So very humbled to be here. Topic for today, at least from the ISETA perspective, is relatively narrow and just in one of our legislative priorities that we're hoping to push this year, which is virtual net metering, which I'll get into in a minute. But if we think about what our legislative priorities are and what we're narrowly trying to tackle, we're trying to thread the needle on something that's going to be impactful for the industry, something that, we think we can actually get implemented, something that we can get passed, and hopefully something that we can build a relatively good coalition around to make that happen. So for a number of years, we had the tax credit, which was very and highly successful for the industry. And there over the last couple of years, all the conversations around anything tax related got incredibly tough in Des Moines there. And so we needed to find something else that we thought could kind of move the needle and be helpful. And one of the issues that, we've identified over the years is there's a lot of customers who would love to install a solar project, but they may not have the necessary land or the building, or there's a wide variety of economic factors on a specific project, which don't make it a good fit necessarily. So for those of you who, a lot of people in here are very educated on the topics, but may not be familiar, I'll kind of back up on why, especially the investor-owned utilities in Iowa are attractive targets for projects, and that's because they have annual net metering. So any overproduction that doesn't get used, say, immediately during the summer, you can pull back down on that bank of credit, say on a dark, gloomy winter day or at night or at other times of high usage. And that's really what helps drive the economics of some of these projects. And so, say you're a hog farmer and you have two barns that are 5 miles apart, maybe it doesn't make economic sense to build two smaller systems. Or, I think the city of Perry recently did a project and you have 5 or 10 buildings in a small town and you want to do a project, and installing 5 smaller systems is expensive because you have a lot of soft cost. You're connecting to those 5 or 10 different meters. You have 5 or 10 different plan sets. And when you look at it from a grid perspective, doing all of this work is kind of goofy because there's just electrons flowing in that local area, and it doesn't necessarily have to be produced on that building or behind that 1 meter. And so if you kind of look outside of Iowa, you see it happening in a lot of states. Is either some form of community solar where a big array, say in Illinois, for example, you might build a 5, 6, 7 megawatt array, and a lot of people will subscribe to the energy being produced from that array. So we thought, that large community solar aspect might be difficult, but what if we could kind of narrow the scope down just a little bit? And so what we came up with was this idea of virtual net metering, where what we're proposing is 10 or less people could get together, build an array that's a little off-site from maybe where that usage is going to occur, and then just using software and metering, allowing the production from that array to go to that small number of customers. So in order to make it palatable, we kept the size of the array to 1 megawatt or less and 10 subscribers or less. So we're not trying necessarily to create a community solar program where hundreds or thousands of people are going to subscribe to it, but have it be a practical solution for what a lot of our customers are facing. And so I think this could unlock a lot of interesting projects. If there's one local business who has a great roof for solar, for example, maybe a few other local businesses would be able to subscribe to the energy being produced on that one roof. Maybe I think Cheryl sent me another example of, there's some homeowners and there's an empty parking lot nearby. They think that they could convert, and maybe, you got some trees or other things that are going to shade those roofs. You could kind of consolidate all that consumption and usage and pull the energy off of that local asset. So again, just trying to thread that needle there of something that shouldn't be scary to the utility companies. Hopefully we can get broad support for, and it's not really shifting what the solar industry is doing today. It's just kind of removing a few of those small barriers that stand in the way of good projects as well. So I don't think I quite took up the full 10 or 15 minutes there, but we're just trying to be really narrow with that bill and gain support. We introduced it last year and kind of got some feedback and used kind of the off season here to get feedback from a few other people and position it. And as I'm sure Andy and Warren will tell you, there's a lot of energy legislation coming down the pipe this year. So we're hopeful or optimistic that some of that will kind of take shape, and maybe we can attach this or move this along with some other legislation that is also happening. So happy to take questions later and really appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks, Liz. I'm not going to complain that you stay under time. That's a rarity in these events, but I think that just to comment on your what you were saying with the the sort of the virtual net metering issue. There's also a huge benefit when you can take and aggregate any kind of a solar array where it's not on 10 households, because the economies of scale of the cost of installation have to go down pretty dramatically. If you can put that all on one site, you don't have all these different people and the soft costs and the different roof structures and all that piece. It makes it more affordable on a kilowatt basis, correct?
Yeah, it makes the cost of the install is going to go down because of the soft costs. You're getting into economies of scale. And then, the other benefit is just, you can kind of consolidate just where that asset's going to sit, what it's going to produce long term, and just have more people pulling from it. Otherwise, you might be installing suboptimal arrays. Maybe you have something that's not directly south facing, or it's going to be partially shaded. So there is the economy of the scale of the installation, but you can also kind of optimize the production. So you're winning on the back end of it by getting that increased production as well. So it's a 2-for-1 in a lot of cases.
Excellent. Thanks. I'm sure we'll come back to you in a few minutes here. I'm going to turn the floor over to Warren McKenna, and he can talk a little bit about his illustrious history in all of this.
Start the slides. Well, I have a few, just 7 minutes here, so a minute per slide. The largest project I worked on last year was a gigawatt of solar for a farm group in Southwest Iowa. Just to give you a little background, since I've retired, that's the largest. I don't know if it's going to go or not. Helped with the RFP, basically wrote the land lease portion of it, and worked with some farmers on transmission siting. Next slide. Thanks to JCED and Craig Mosier. I liked in his email, let's do it. I wanted to quote him today. On the utilities are faced with this curve. They're adjusting their rates because solar's hitting this peak, and I don't think my pointer's going to work here, but we have EVs coming in. This is in the Iowa Energy Center PV guide, and they use this as a way to actually discount solar. So storage is going to be very valuable going forward. I think the EVs will have to be charged at night. We're reaching for 100% load factor, of course. Local solar with storage is going to be a necessity, mainly for backup. Again, the rates are going to be driving some of this curve shift more and more because demand rates are climbing. Next slide. Back a number of years ago, Joe Bolcom introduced the community solar garden bill. It's dead, but it kind of ties into the virtual net metering. There's some good language in there. Customer participation, no more than 40% for rate regulated utilities on their sales, 200 watt minimum, no more than 120% higher than their usage. the ownership, it kind of all ties into what Lewis was talking about. Next slide. I'd like to see that bill resurrected, basically. This is a project I worked on with Tim Dwight this past year. The solar was sited in a catch basin, and it's a 1.2 megawatt of solar half a mile away. So we built a high voltage distribution network in this down in Missouri to tie this back into 5 meters. There's 8 meters total. Some of the solar was sited on the buildings, and that solar array, I don't have pictures of the completed project, but we completed that project. What's possible, I think, also ties into virtual net metering. There's 8 meters we had to go back to. Had this been a virtual net metering site, we could have metered it at the array, cut a lot of that distribution network and distribute it on paper. But we decided to spend an extra $1 million to, these people wanted the solar. So, and the solar was sited in this catch basin, which took no good land. So yeah, great project. It's finished, which is about 2-3 years during COVID, part of it. Hard to get supplies right now, and then especially. Next slide. So UL rated equipment is it's huge in the new code. I took some training here a while back. I keep electrical license updated, and UL is going to have a major impact on what you can and can't do. So we're worried about local policy, and local policy is driven from the National Electric Code. And some of the drivers in the National Electric Code are the Underwriters Laboratory certifications. Next slide. So I show in the upper top is a typical grid tied, but mostly a battery system. Does not meet the UL ratings. It currently has a code in the new code. So I want to point that out. I don't see how you can go off grid today and stay within the code requirements. Next, the bottom one is a large Tesla power pack down at Wellman, Iowa. That is, utilities are not subject to the NEC. And so you don't have some of these requirements on the utility scale stuff that you're facing on commercial and residential in the real world. Next slide. So the reason that previous slide does not meet code, each one of those power packs are limited to 20 kilowatt hours. You're limited to 40 kilowatt hours per house. And if you want to do the site assessment, you can't go off grid with 40 kilowatt hours. Next slide. This is another client we had in Iowa that we're actually looking at doing a powerhouse and doing existing homes, serving it from one powerhouse, one solar array, and 4 homes per powerhouse, which would eliminate 4 meters. You'd have the utility would actually become the backup to the battery bank. So you reduce that to 1 meter. Very feasible. The client backed out at this point. We'll keep coming back at it. So that's all I have. We'll leave it for questions.
All right, thanks, Warren. At this point, I think we can start with anyone in the room that's a question. And then Anne's going to give me some questions that may have popped up in the chat online.
Right, so if you have any questions for those zooming in, please drop them in the chat and I will see them and then.
That's great. Yep. Yeah.
Thanks, Travis. My question's for Lewis. Lewis, this is Chris Hoffman. I'm with Eagle Point Solar. We've met virtually a couple of times. My question is about virtual net metering that you were talking about, and your optimism that Alliance of Mid-American may be open to this discussion. But can you tell me a little bit why, where they are making it difficult for interconnections for homeowners and businesses, why this might be something that gets their attention? What's in it for them?
I think my optimism is not necessarily related to Mid-American and Alliant being excited about this. My optimism has more to do with I think we can build potentially like an effective coalition around this. I think that there's pretty reasonable arguments about why this shouldn't be outright banned. I mean, they're putting up their own generation, they're selling their own subscriptions. Our argument is we just want to do this at a much smaller scale. And in some ways, many of these installations could be smaller than what people are already doing behind the meter. So my optimism is just general optimism, not that I think that they're going to come to the table and help us get this passed, as much as I wish that was the case.
Yeah, Andy, do you want to weigh in on that too? I know that there's a lot of efforts from Fortune 100 companies to get exceptions, legislative exceptions, so that they have access to, some of these benefits of virtual or other net metering that is not currently being discussed as being available for residential or commercial within the state. How do you see that playing out as an argument that if those exceptions are made for Fortune 100 companies in the state or that want to come in and do this in the state, how that might play with IUB?
Yeah, it's a good question. There are actually a couple of potential policies related to the large electric customers only, and they're a little confusing because they're very different in who the proponents are. The tech companies, we think led by Google under the umbrella of this group, Iowa Economic Alliance, which won't release who their members truly are, but you've seen some media coverage of this, are really pushing what they call competitive wholesale direct access. In other words, they want to be able to buy power off customers through the regulated utilities, Mid-American and Alliant. Many states have this. Many states, of course, have less regulated or restructured or deregulated markets. Iowa does not, but there are some states that still have mostly regulated markets and yet allow their large customers direct access. There are a lot of potential pitfalls to that approach, of course. An electric system has a lot of socialized costs, no matter how much the user pays. And if the large customers are allowed to leave, what does that leave the rest of the customer base with? Well, so who knows, is it a good idea or not? But there's the question of, well, if a policy like that moves, could other things move with it? A lot of legislative pieces get tacked together, get amendments onto something else. The other big policy that's out there that the utilities are promoting, Mid-American especially, is something called flex rates. So they would love to have the ability, and they tried this at the utilities board already a couple of years ago, to offer a special rate to large industrials that would be 100% clean energy. Because some of large industrials have, of course, clean energy goals. And so they want to be able to offer that rate. And the board said, well, now wait a minute, if you do that and you're not offering, isn't that discriminatory? You're not offering it to the rest of your customer base. And if you're offering 100% clean energy to largest customers, then you're essentially removing some of your clean energy, and the energy you're providing to the rest of the customer base is actually dirtier than what you're claiming. So that's not quite fair. Well, so what we understand anyway at this point is Mid-American anyway is working directly with the administration and the legislature, hoping to get legislatively implemented flex rate authority to do that and override the utility board. So there are these two big things, direct market access, the utilities do not like. They don't want to lose those customers. Flex rates, they would like. If either of those move, is there a chance to glom on something else that would actually benefit a large number of Iowa ratepayers, like virtual net metering? And one of the points I want to make on that virtual net metering is the Iowa legislature bipartisan unanimously, already codified net metering. When was it? These years run together. It was 3 or 4 years ago, the utilities tried to kill net metering legislatively. That failed. And the very following year, coalition of advocates and utilities eventually came on board, and the legislature codified and said net metering is the law of the land in Iowa, and customers have a right to it and they specified all the conditions, and then the tariffs were developed. A really important talking point, I think, in this V&M conversation is the fact that net metering happens currently behind the meter, as Lewis said, and half, give or take, of all ratepayers don't have the opportunity to connect behind their meter. They're renters, they're large users, they don't have space, they have too much shade, they're institutional users with no fields to put, solar behind next to the school or the city. And so really V&M is just taking what the legislature said is already the policy of Iowa and saying, hey, in fairness, we actually realized that didn't quite meet the needs of Iowans. So here's how we open it up to all ratepayers. So, you know, it's an expansion of an existing policy already.
Thanks, Andy. Mike,
Yeah, hi Stratis, thanks. It's wonderful to be here. I'm Mike Carberry with Bright Future Iowa. And our main job is to work with counties on siting ordinance for both wind and solar. And thank you, Andy, for covering a lot of the poison pills that we've seen. I've got one more that we just saw recently in Buchanan County. And not only were there setbacks and CSR, but they are only allowing wind and solar in a manufacturing zoned land. And they claim that wind and solar production is manufacturing, and I said, oh, really? Where are the trucks dropping off the raw goods? Where are the employees assembling things? And where are the trucks taking away the finished goods? Okay, so the definition of manufacturing is very loose there. We like to say that all farming is solar farming. We're just harvesting the power of the sun to create energy, and that could be through photosynthesis, crops, or the grays, or for wind and solar. And that energy is just another crop, and that right to farm should be with the farmer, that they should be able to farm. Now, other sightings we've seen is setbacks. We had a bill introduced the first day of the legislature. This is SF2, introduced on Monday. And it has a wind setback of 5,000 feet from non-participating land. Recently, Woodbury County passed a 2,500 foot setback, and that was against Mid-American Wind Farm. And Mid-American said if they had had a 2,500 foot setback, that they would have only been able to install 1% of their current wind fleet. Now, Mid-American is the largest owner of wind of any investor-owned utility. What would doubling that create? That would probably be zero. So this is a poison pill. This is a wind kill bill. This, if SF2 passes, it will kill all future wind farms in the state of Iowa. And we are afraid also of a similar bill on solar with excessive setbacks of 1,000 to 1,500 feet with CSR in it, and maybe even this manufacturing zoned land. And so we need to be very, very careful on a statewide bill. Now, maybe it would be a good bill, but undoubtedly it would not be like last year's bill that did get through the House Ag or Senate Ag Committee, but it never got voted on the floor. So other things to watch out for are those things. Thank you, Andy. And I don't know if you want to comment on that, but I just wanted everybody to know that there's other things to be aware of. Thanks.
Yep. I agree. Those are really big challenges.
question here in the,
I want to follow up on something Chris said, what's in it for the utility companies? And it seems to me like the resiliency of the grid ought to be in it for the utilities companies. And I'm wondering about that, when the electricity goes down, solar goes down. In other words, there's no way, that I understand it, that you can get solar back into the grid to help with resiliency issues. Is there any movement on any of that so that, you know, other than batteries, that we can get solar back into the grid to improve that resiliency when we have a serious emergency?
yeah, thanks for that question. I don't know if someone from the panel wants to take that on. All I will say is that, you know, the decentralized solar, right, not utility scale. Actually, it doesn't go down when the grid goes down, right? It's more, you can have these different circuit breakers that allow different areas to stay online. So solar is actually more resilient than fossil fuel energy in that sense. It can be, right? Think about those fossil fuels, they're burning something, but they're still converting that and tying that to the grid anyway. So if the grid goes down, it doesn't matter if it's fossil fuels or if it's solar, depends on how that structure looks, the transmission of it. So I don't know if Andy or Lewis or Warren, you want to comment on that?
You know, I think my comment here is, looking at some utilities, it's kind of a black box because you're not quite sure where all the assets are at or how they're valuing those assets or exactly what's going on. So, there's a lot of conversations happening now, at the distribution or transmission level about what upgrades may or may not be required, how old is some of that infrastructure. And so, if there's a little bit more transparency around some of that, you could foresee our side of the industry, for example, maybe working to place, some DG in areas that would be helpful to them. But without that knowledge, it's kind of impossible to do. So that's just kind of one of the challenges is how do you value these distributed resources when, we only see one half of the picture, so to speak.
Or the shift to microgrids.
Yeah.
Going to be critical, if we want reliability.
Cheryl, I know the questions are here.
Well, can we currently get off, is it now possible to go off the grid if you've got a solar system? Could you explain that? What needs to happen in order legislatively or IUB in order to go off the
It
grid
depends
and
if
have these
you,
microgrids?
According to the current NEC, it would be impossible to put the batteries in the house, for example. Enough storage in your house currently, under current code to go off grid. You could put it in a detached building, have to be pretty large, do the spacing requirement. But it's possible, it's just costly. Everyone should be driving that cost up.
Steve, I see.
Bottom line is off grid is expensive regardless.
Right.
So,
But we're about $3 a watt. Right now, we're where solar was 10 years ago. So the cost of the batteries are coming down huge. If you can get 30% off of that on the reduction app, we're looking at some pretty good sized projects. Farmers aren't subject to the same requirements in Iowa that the residential customer is. So we're looking at sizing some pretty good sized projects.
Craig, I know you've got a question over here.
Yeah, I would just like to take a minute to highlight an article by Bill McKibben that showed up in the New Yorker on December 27th. He calls it From Climate Exhortation to Climate Execution. And I've got some hard copies if anybody would like one. It's also, there's going to be a link in the chat.
I just dropped it.
And there's a link on our johnsonCleanEnergyDistrict.org website and stuff. So,
Okay, that's this one.
yeah, sure, that'd be great. So also I want to mention last night on PBS News Hour, they had a nice segment on heat pumps. And so that would be at pbs.org. We could use that. We could circulate that to people and circulate this article. But McKibben argues the time to scale is now. He quotes Martin Luther King, the fierce urgency of now is upon us. And he talks about obviously using the IRA and the infrastructure funding that's helping with the finance part of it. Green Penny Bank up in Decorah is an excellent green bank source of funding for some of these projects and a model for other banks. Gibbon argues that we need to do group buys like that Midwest Renewable Energy Association organized in Lynn and Johnson counties. Several folks here have worked on making those happen. But if he's arguing that we can't do it if we do it house by house. We have to do it city by city, neighborhood by neighborhood, church by church, to scale this rapidly enough. And so the reason for that is that the soft costs are a very significant part of the cost of installing solar. The cost of the contractor to do all the visits to the homeowner or customer and organize go through the rebates and all that stuff could be done, as Andy talked about, as technical assistance by the energy district or other organizations. And organizing group buys could be done by other organizations so that contractors can focus on putting panels on roofs and out in the field. He also talks about need to upgrade the transmission grid, offshore wind, all that kind of stuff. And he mentioned Saul Griffith's seminal book called Electrify, that really details this whole process of electrifying everything, basically, including transportation and all that. So I really think that we can circulate the McKenna article and get people on board with this. That'll help. So let's do it.
Thanks, Craig. And, yeah, the University of Iowa had Saul Griffith come in last spring, and there's a recording that's available
Yes.
that we can link to on JCED or send out to people that he did, I think, a great discussion of what electrification looks like from top to A to Z. And can you read for me some of the questions that we
Sure.
received from the audience on Zoom?
Absolutely. So Christine asked, what are the main reasons that setbacks and CSR have such traction among voters and legislators? Which arguments are persuasive? I'm interested in how we can balance the narrative.
It's not in my backyard issue.
And then,
Well, the corn growers, the soybean association and the Farm Bureau are, have become kind of anti-renewable energy. They would like to save every last acre for corn and bean production, which feeds not only our gas tanks, but the CAFOs, confined animal feeding operation. So that narrative hasn't gone to the voters yet. This is the supervisors who are often very swayed by the Farm Bureau, because the Farm Bureau is the most powerful political force in the state of Iowa, even much more powerful than the combined forces of the investor-owned utilities, the rural electric co-ops, and the municipal electric companies. So nothing happens in the state that the Farm Bureau doesn't allow to happen, and they can kill anything. So there's been a lot of pressure on especially rural counties and their supervisors that if they want to get reelected, that they ought to put some of these poison pills in their renewable energy siting ordinances. It's a big fight.
And just to add to that, there are, again, the certain valid issues. There are rural people saying, not in my backyard. There are people saying we need to keep more farmland for the young farmers, doesn't hold a lot of water, but there's a little bit of truth there. But there's also, I think we really need to recognize, that the anti-renewables movement, again, is nationwide, it's manufactured, it's well-funded. And it is about political identity, like so much of our culture today. And so just to add to that, I think we need to not just try and counter with logical arguments, because we all know how that goes sometimes against, conspiracy theories, basically. I'm just being totally frank here. But we need to be able to also counter it with pro-renewables, with just pro-renewables, people and arguments and movement. And that includes on both sides of the political spectrum, on all ends of the political spectrum. There are a lot of pro-renewable Republicans out there, and there are a number of pro-renewable Republican legislators in this legislature. They've made their voices known in the past through things like net metering. And so I think we need to cultivate that and really promote that. It's not just about answering the NIMBYs. It's about saying, look, this is what is important to Iowa, and this is why it's so important. And if we continue to support those, all voices in the legislature, and all voices in our local communities and counties, it can't just be a liberal or Democratic thing, to be totally honest. We need to really build that bipartisan coalition or maintain it, because in Iowa, we have good polls going back 15 years showing that 80+% of Iowans in both parties have supported renewable energy. Now that's starting to slip, unfortunately, on one side, but it's still significant majority supporting renewable energy. So we really, really need to cultivate that. Not just try and respond directly to the NIMBYs.
One counter argument that we try to focus on is just economics, especially with that other party that Andy was referring to. 85 counties in Johnson County are losing, in Iowa are losing population, yet they still have the same number of roads and bridges that they need to maintain. And so when you have a declining tax base, where do you get that money? And part of it is why we focus on renewable energy, especially utility size applications, is the taxes that they create, the jobs that they create. So if you can focus on economic development and jobs for Iowans, that can be a winning argument. So we have seen Republican-led counties realizing that they want renewable energy in their county, and they will not put these poison pills in their ordinances. So
couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. Clean energy prosperity. We try and preach that rural, ever since we've been working in this area with the energy districts. And it really matters. Jolene made a great comment right now in chat. during the net metering debate, actually, the pork producers were really important. The pork producers have been seeing benefits from solar for, for 10 years. And they said, we need to keep that door open, and they spoke up. So yeah, there are definitely those voices, and that prosperity matters. And so one more piece of that actually that maybe would be a legislative priority or opportunity, if we could streamline and clarify the taxation and local benefits of utility scale renewables. It's a pretty convoluted process right now, and it's difficult to explain, for example, the county supervisors. But the legislature could take a look at saying, look, we need to put more of the prosperity benefits of utility scale solar and wind into those local communities. And here's how we're going to do it. Reform that process, increase the dollars flowing from the tax benefits of utility scale renewables to counties. Money talks, right? that could do a whole lot. You could even tag a small amount of those dollars flowing, a small portion, say, of land leases that go to landowners, a matching portion, very small, towards adjacent landowners. Put the money where our mouth is. The utilities, they've got plenty of it, right? It's actually a real policy option that we could look at.
Andy or Lewis, I mean, is there a discussion that, or there's a perception on the part of the public, right, that are not landowners, that this is somehow in some form, these arrays are outsiders coming in? It's almost like a quasi eminent domain thing where they're coming in and they don't understand that these are voluntary agreements with landowners, and that the notion that, the independence of I do what I want with my property, right? And how does that reconcile with some of these arguments that farmers themselves are the beneficiaries largely of these utility scale solar projects?
Story or that narrative out there, right? If you're a handful of farmers leasing out your ground for the next 20 or 30 years, it's, I don't want to say a little awkward, but you're not necessarily out promoting like, hey, this is great for my family, this is great for my farm, this is great for my community, as much as some of these other organized interests are. So you just kind of have this asymmetric narrative and storytelling out there in a lot of cases. At least that's part of my perspective, is the story is just not getting told effectively. And part of that onus is on solar developers to be out there and be proactive with, holding local meetings, having good PR and communications. But like, there's no mistake about it. These large arrays, I mean, it takes an immense amount of capital and organization to come in and build these projects. And, for better or for worse, you're not always going to find that wherever the best siting is for these projects. So that is a hurdle that has to be overcome. But, that's just where the industry needs to be very diligent about how they approach some of these projects.
And there's also been these discussions about the culture of these rural areas, right? It's, I think, the big argument that people make is that it changes the landscape aesthetic, it changes the culture of these areas, and so therefore people who do put this in have gotten pushback where their neighbors don't want to talk to them, or because there's this notion of you're changing what I expect rural communities to look like. We have to, I think, do a better job with how we talk about that. Is there one more question online, Ann, and I'll come back to the room here?
There actually is.
Okay.
I've
Okay.
been inviting.
Great. We'll go back over here.
I talked to my cousin who farms like 1,200 acres in central Iowa. And his concern with solar, because he's got a farm that's right next to a transmission line. And it would be, perfect for solar, but he said that the way the contract reads, in 20 years, they would abandon it in place. And, he was concerned about that and having to remove the solar array, even though they last, upwards of 40, 50 years. But that was his concern, and that was a big barrier for him, removing the ability to remove those arrays. So whoever put them on there would say that in 20 years, we will abandon it in place or remove it, depending on what the farmer wants. That would take care of a serious barrier for him anyway.
Right. Does anyone can Andy or Lewis, can you comment on that? I'm sure that's something that can be amortized into the entire contract, but if you have any suggestions about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a variety of contract mechanisms out there to do it, whether it's, putting money in escrow or there's a lot of things you can do on the contract side of that to kind of negotiate around that, even if you don't trust the developer that they're going to be around in 20, 30 years to take it out. Just like behind the curtain a little bit, you know, when we're modeling out our power purchase agreements for 20 or 30 year agreements, we're assuming that we are going to renegotiate for another 10 or 15 years on that array, whether we repower it or whatever we do. You know, our contract is for 25 and there's the option to terminate it at that point, but we're assuming at that point in time that we're going to be able to negotiate and continue on. So it really just, that's problems like that, I think, are at the developer level, and there's certainly ways to alleviate those concerns if the project's viable, I think.
Thanks, Louis.
Well, there are also, yeah, that plus, I mean, there are great models for model ordinances for renewable energy, solar and wind at the county level. We worked with our local county on that. There are templates from Great Plains Institute, for example, from other organizations, and they all include modest setbacks, and they all include you know, what happens when it's done, when the terms are up. They include bonding for the long-term land management, for removal, that kind of thing. So good policy can include all that really easily. It doesn't need to be road blocking. I just saw that Warren was leaving. Unfortunately, I was going to tap him one more time because we've had some interesting conversation around, you know, the large scale utility scale issues, and then the consumer level issues behind the meter, even as Craig mentioned, is the McKibben article. And so much of what Warren talks about and has worked on is the middle ground, where there's tremendous opportunity, not just behind the customer meter, but behind the substation. In other words, on the distribution grid. And this is something that I think we can all work on, which is why I mentioned it. It's not just a matter of state policy. But an awful lot of large, significant scale renewables and other distributed energy resources, storage included, can be done by utilities and communities on the distribution grid, not just behind somebody's meter. And there's room there. And they won't be 100, 200 megawatt systems. Maybe they'll be 5 and 10 and 20 megawatt systems, but those can go in hundreds, if not thousands of locations on the distribution grid around Iowa right now, and they can fit in our landscape. And the reason I mentioned Warren is because he did this. He's done this with Farmers Electric when he was there. He led that charge. There are 35 or so rural electric co-ops in Iowa and 135 or so municipal electric utilities. Those consumer-owned utilities need to be some of our conversation partners, all of us, because they're not necessarily ahead of the game. They're all over the map and looking at these opportunities, but we can help them understand that. And some of them are starting to get there, and they could start building this system on their distribution grids, which makes that grid really resilient, really reliable, and brings up these resources. So maybe Louis can talk a little bit more too, if they've done a lot of work on distribution grids. But we often talk about, okay, how can we, you know, be resilient from the next storms, and can you grid defect, or can you be grid independent? Well, distribution grids can be grid independent. There are already a number of munis and Farmers Electric Co-op, for example, that can flick the switch if the transmission lines go down and entirely serve their community. So this isn't just about at the customer level or at the huge level. That distribution grid is a tremendous opportunity.
Thanks, Andy. Louis, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think my comment is just like a higher level comment, and it encapsulates a lot of what we discussed today. Is there's just so many stakeholders, and there's investor owns, there's the co-ops, there's munis, there's people who want to own behind the meter assets, and getting everyone on the same page and going in the right direction, right, as we all know, is a long slog. So I just think having more of those conversations can only be beneficial, and determining who can benefit and keeping those benefits local, I think is the key selling point.
Thank you. Becky has a question. I'm going to get to Craig next. Becky online asked Andy to talk about what currently happens with utility scale tax income and how that goes to counties or doesn't right now. What's the current setup for that?
Yeah, some of it does. It's actually a different process for wind and solar, and I don't know enough to talk super intelligently about the details. Steve, do you want to jump in on that?
It's a formula process where it's based on the amount of generation that it has, based on thing specific to that particular facility and then the portion back to various entities, so. And yes, it's much more complicated than the scenario.
Thanks, John. Craig, I give you a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Steve Geyer to say a word about the Iowa Environmental Council's new website that gives us great information on the rebates and stuff.
Sure, so we have a new website, it's called Iowa Federal Funding.
Iowa federal funding.
IA federal funding, but yeah. And it basically tries to lay out everything we think is relevant for Iowa in terms of what's in that IRA. There's also IIJA items in there, but the bulk of it is IRA.
Can you disclose for the audience what was that? You mean Inflation Reduction Act?
Inflation Reduction Act, and let's see, the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act, I think. Is what
Right,
that's-
so both federal policies that impact residential customers who want to own solar or put in.
Yes, and so we tried to basically break it down. The intent is to keep it up to date. So as guidance is issued, that will be put out there too. And there will be a tremendous amount of guidance that's going to come down in terms of how all these portions in the act actually will play out.
So if you're a person and you're at home and you're on this Zoom or you're watching it recorded later, going and visiting the IECs, so the Iowa Environmental Council's website, and looking for some of this information can help you make decisions about whether or not these federal policies that are going to trickle down to residential homeowners is going to help you, or if you're a business owner, it's going to help you.
Business, or I'll say that really one of the major things that occurred with the Inflation Reduction Act was the ability for any non-tax paying entity, nonprofits, to take advantage of those incentives. So if you had a tax credit as a business, that nonprofit will be able to get a direct check from the treasury for that same amount.
I mean, we're in discussions at the University of Iowa about that. I mean, we didn't have a tax appetite, and we do,
Right.
and that's a game changer in terms of us being able to capture some benefits.
And Steve, the URL for that is iafederalfunding.org.
Yes, www.iafederalfunding.org.
I got it.
All right, we'll put it in the chat. Oh, thanks, Ann. Yeah, that's great.
I want to address Casey's question a little bit about decommissioning.
Yeah.
A good county ordinance covers that and covers liability and everything else. And so in general, a lot of independent developers of utility solar will put in the cheapest project they possibly can. And that's why you need good policy at the county level, which is where we cite it. Good policy makes good projects. We've seen that with Clenera, their project down in Louisa County. They just put turf grass underneath, right? We've seen developers put gravel underneath because gravel needs no maintenance at all, right? And we've seen the benefits of having a nice prairie mix underneath that, but in fencing and setbacks, if you don't require a developer to do something, they will not. They want to make as much money as possible. That's what. So we need to have really good local policies wherever they're cited.
Thanks, Mike. I think it's a great way to wrap up here. I want to thank Louis and Andy and Warren and Absentia for participating. Thanks to Cheryl and Craig and Betsy for
And Ann.
and Ann for pulling this together, and everyone who attended. If you came in late, this is going to be put up as a recording on the JCED, the Johnson Clean Energy District website, and you can watch it there, or you can share it with all your friends. Thank you very much, and we'll see you. Our next event is on February 9th, and it's going to be discussing private investment in solar. And Casey Cook will lead discussion with lenders and investors. So it's a different angle on this, and we hope to see you there. Thank you.
Thank you.